Welcome to the Vitality Vision podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bennett, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-hosts, David Vogel and Barry Miller, who are the CEO and president of Voloridge Health and Voloridge Investment Management. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Tommy Wood. Dr. Tommy Wood's new book, The Stimulated Mind, comes out on March 24th, and we unpack the book in this episode, and it's just absolutely incredible, the takeaways that we get in terms of how do we keep our brain performing as we age, and how do we avoid things like dementia and cognitive brain decline. Tommy's background is absolutely incredible. He has an undergraduate degree from Cambridge University. He has a medical degree from Oxford University, and he has a PhD in physiology and neuroscience from Oslo University. He's absolutely brilliant. You will not want to miss this episode, and in fact, you're going to want to share it with all your family and friends because it really is fantastic. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as we all did. Until next time, cheers. Tommy, mate, great to see you back, buddy. It's been a long time since I've seen you in person. You were here at the Voloridge Health and the Voloridge Investment Management end-of-year talks at the end of 2024. We all absolutely thoroughly love that. And to have you join us on the Vitality Vision podcast is a real thrill for David, Barry, and myself, mate. So thank you for finding the time. This has not been easy for everybody listening. We have three people, and not me, that actually time is very limited. So we really want to dive into this episode. Tommy has a new book coming out in March, is it, Tommy?
Yeah, end of March, March 24th.
All right, fantastic. And so that book is called The Stimulated Mind, which all of us, we were lucky enough to get a pre-copy of that and read it ourselves. And first off, just got to say congrats, mate. Absolutely brilliant book. And I'm not just saying that because you're here.
And because I mention you in the book.
Well, I do get a page in the book. I was going to just leave it there. No, I actually didn't want to just talk about that. But it really is a book that I enjoy because it leans heavily into the science for moments, and then it comes out with a little bit of self-deprecating humor from time to time on your end, and then some really great action and insight. So I just think it was an absolutely fantastic book. But before we dive into that, maybe just for people that haven't met you, could you just give us a quick little background as to who you are?
Sure. Lovely to see you all. Fantastic to be here. Really looking forward to this. So my main day job is as a neuroscientist at the University of Washington, where I'm an associate professor. I study ways to treat the injured brain in newborn babies, in adults after traumatic brain injury, and increasingly looking at ways to either prevent injuries like traumatic brain injury or prevent cognitive decline and dementia in older adults. So trying to take a sort of a full brain health across the lifespan kind of perspective. I also do some work with professional athletes, particularly Formula One drivers, helping to oversee their sort of health and performance programs as head scientist for motorsport for a company called Hints of Performance. And then I do a few other bits of work related to dementia and dementia prevention. So I'm head of research for a charity called Food for the Brain, which is a dementia prevention charity in the UK, and chief science officer of Better Brain, which is a company over here in the US that is aimed at dementia prevention, provides brain health coaching, and the biggest free online platform in terms of helping people support their brain health. So that gives me a few different areas to kind of work in when we're thinking about our brains as they age.
Amazing, mate. And you know, you missed out your background in education, which I mentioned in the intro that I do. But what I love about you is the fact that, yes, you have the neuroscience, but you also have the physiology. And so you're able to look at it from a very holistic view when we look at the human body. And, you know, I want to dive into the book right now. But one of the big takeaways from the book was that it was, yes, we're looking at the brain. Yes, we're looking at cognitive function as we age. But it's like how the whole body works together as one, I thought was really fascinating. And with your background, I think you were the perfect person to write this book. What inspired you to start the book now? Like, what was the timing of this?
I've always wanted to write a book. And for a long time, I was actually discouraged by people that were like, you write a book and then 3 months later it's out of date, and you should invest your time in other things. And then I got to a point where all these different strands of my career kind of came together. So the work with athletes, the work with these different sort of pockets of neuroscience and research, where I kind of felt like I was seeing the same factors being critical for how a brain either performs or recovers, across decades of the human lifespan. And so much so that I was like, this stuff isn't going out of date anytime soon. Like, this is always going to be important. Yes, we will learn more. Yes, AI and technology will change things, but this stuff is always going to matter. So I got to a point where I was like, I think I can write something that's going to be relevant for at least a few years. And then if people read the book, they'll appreciate that. I think that the most important thing for our brains in terms of determining how they function is how we use them, right? Which requires building new skills, taking on new cognitive challenges. So writing a book was a significant cognitive challenge for me. So that's me trying to, walk the walk partly. And then also there was never really a book that I felt I could just give to people when they asked me about brains and brain health that was sort of very evidence-based, but also very practical. So I tried to take it upon myself to write that book.
That's amazing. And you've just done the audio version? Because I don't read books. I'm like, when's the audio version coming out?
I'm recording it right now. It will be released at the same time as the hard copy.
Oh, good. You didn't get a celebrity to do your audio.
What do you mean?
You want his voice, Barry? What are you saying?
So, some people I know have taken the PDF and they put it through AI tool, an app called Speechify. And the guy who plays Gimli in Lord of the Rings, he has a British accent. So people have been using him to read my book to them because my audiobook isn't. So some people have got a celebrity reading my
I did that exact thing at 3 times the speed. So it was like I listened to, because I had 3 days for free on Speechify to read your book. That's how cheap I am. I'm like, it was fantastic though. It was a good way to do it.
You should have picked Snoop Dogg. He's one of the people who could have read the book to you.
I think you're really entertaining.
Well, Barry and David, you guys, what did you think of the book yourselves? I want to, we haven't had a chance to discuss it. I know you both.
Put you on the spot.
No, I'm putting him on the spot. I am, because they're like, what? No, I know they have read it, and I know they've been incredibly busy too. But I think we've all kind of stepped away, going, that was a really amazing book. I'd just love to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, I think it's a great book. I mean, really fills a gap, as Tommy explained, combining research, like good hard research and numbers with practical advice. So I really enjoyed the read.
Thanks.
Yeah, I thought it was great as well. And congrats, Tommy, on I know we know from talking with you that this was a long journey to produce and put together a good book like this is no easy task. So congrats for slugging through it and getting it done. And I thought it was great. The blending of science and stories and some of your background, I think it came together, as well as you hopefully expected.
Yeah. Thanks. I'm glad.
Is there a target audience that you're looking for? I kind of feel like us three are almost like a target audience, being that we're in our mid-50s and we're all like, we're just hanging in. But we are. I feel like you get to this kind of age that we're at. I don't know if it starts in the 40s. For me, it was like in the 50s. There's a little bit of I've got to really focus on what potentially could happen to me in this next 10, 20, 30 years, especially as I've got young kids. Is there a target audience that you wrote it for?
Yeah, there wasn't really when I sort of started out, but I think the message and ideas have resonated most, with people in sort of your or our age group, sort of 40s to 50s, both men and women, and even some like people like down into their like 20s and 30s, because they're kind of worried about their brains with everything going on, right? They feel stressed, overwhelmed. They're being told that everybody's going to get dementia in the next 2 or 3 decades. So actually, I've been surprised pleasantly by sort of like the breadth of people who've kind of felt like this might be relevant to them.
Was that goal also to create a book that was more above the shoulders?
Yeah. So just because of like my personal nature, so like anything I write is gonna be like that. If the references aren't in the main body of the book, because I have 2,000 citations throughout the book, and the editor was like, this will add another 50% of the pages to the book, and I can't afford to print that. So the references will be online. So if anybody wants to like really dig into the science, all of those things will be easily available. But I know that, you know, most people want to know that it's evidence-based, but also they just want to know, like, what are the practical takeaways? So the idea was really to try and balance the two, satisfy the nerds like me. And I know David will probably go like hunting in the reference list. But, you know, I also wanted it to be really sort of accessible to people who didn't necessarily want to have to, you know, read pages and pages of statistics and numbers and all that kind of stuff. So
you're writing it, you're thinking, Greg, dumb it down. David, let's go another.
Exactly. I'm trying to balance the two.
And Barry, you're somewhere in the middle there, mate. All right, buddy. Well, let's shift gear here. I really want to dive into sort of cognitive decline. And I really sort of want to get you to explain to us what's really happening. What's happening to the brain when we say we're losing cognitive function? What is going on?
So there's a few different things going on, and one of the core ideas at the beginning of the book is that one reason why the brain and cognitive decline and dementia still feel like a bit of a black box, both to scientists and to the general population, is that we became so hyper-focused on one specific pathway that occurs in the aging brain, which is the amyloid cascade. So the accumulation of proteins like amyloid and tau, which we know are a part of the process of dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease. But historically, neuroscientists have been so focused on breaking the brain apart into all its different like constituent bits, all the different cells, all the different proteins and organelles within those cells, to try and understand the greater whole. And so we have a huge amount of that kind of information, but we still don't understand the greater whole. We've kind of gone down this massive rabbit hole, and it hasn't really helped us in terms of treating or preventing dementias. And I think that's because we've become very focused on individual pathways rather than thinking about the bigger picture. So one thing that does happen is there are multiple processes of aging that we understand. We know that there's inflammation, oxidative stress. We see changes in terms of metabolic function, you know, the ability to regulate blood sugar. We see changes in how, you know, cells kind of regulate their proteins and how they're turned over. You know, things like, you know, people might have heard of the phrase autophagy. That becomes, you know, works less well as we get older. And so all of these things are kind of happening in concert. But when you sort of expand out a little bit, you also see things like the different networks in the brain, which have specific functions. And we're increasingly appreciating, again, that it's not like this region of the brain does this. That's what we've kind of talked about you know, for the past 100 years. But in reality, you have multiple different regions spread across the entire brain that for a specific function are then like talking to one another in these kind of expanded distributed networks. And so you see some changes in cellular function, and you also then see that these networks become less discrete, right? So they're not really coordinated and organized. They become kind of a bit more dispersed because they're not quite as focused anymore. And what is particularly interesting is that all of those processes can be affected and, you know, potentially reversed, or, you know, those structures and processes maintained through the way that we use our brain. So there was a really interesting recent paper that looked at different creative experiences and the development of expertise in those experiences, like dancing or art or even like video games. And the networks that we see kind of become fuzzier and less functional as we get older, they were actually strengthened by these sort of like complex skills. We also know that when you use a tissue, it starts to like turn over junky proteins and it starts to improve mitochondrial function, all this kind of stuff. So it's much more about, we can talk about all the individual proteins and mechanisms, but it's much more about how are we using that tissue in a coordinated manner and then supporting its function. And we actually don't need to understand all the different biochemistry to know that what we engage our brain with, how we eat, how we sleep, how we move, these are the things that kind of drive long-term function. But we need to kind of step out of the like really basic neuroscience to really appreciate that.
What a great answer, mate. You've mentioned to me in the past that learning to dance is one of the, the greatest things for your brain. It's like the steps in terms of movement, the music itself, the connection with others, the physical movement, all of these things. And you just mentioned it there, and you've found that sort of lights up the brain in terms of how it can actually affect the strengthening of your brain. As we look at other things that we can do, throughout your book, you talk about the importance, and even when you spoke to us at our end of year talks, it was like your talk was on like, I can't remember the title, but basically it was like treat your brain like a bicep muscle, doing curls. It's like we become, the brain functions better when we put it under stress and we overcome that stress, and it just it makes it more resilient. Can you sort of dive into that a little bit about how do we actually build brain resilience?
Yeah, so there are two different ways to think about resilience here. One, again, is like the neuroscience-y one, and then one is more of like the sort of more physiological, psychological kind of one. So in neuroscience, what we would call cognitive resilience is how well your brain resists the accumulation of damage and pathology over time. So they had to invent this idea of resilience because originally we thought something happens, you develop a bunch of amyloid in your brain, and then you get Alzheimer's disease, right? But we know that once adults get into their sort of 70s and older, something like 30% of them will have brains that look like Alzheimer's disease brains, but they function normally, right? And one of the first classic studies of this was the nun study, looking at a whole bunch of nuns and then their brains after they died. They saw that some of these nuns had brains you would have expected them to have dementia, but because of the way they'd engaged and they were like teachers of the younger nuns and these kinds of things, their engagement seemed to provide some protection. So this came up with the idea of resilience because clearly there's something else happening that means that this protein accumulation isn't affecting cognitive function negatively. So we know that there are things that build resilience in that respect. So like exercise is a really important one. So people who exercise more regularly, if they do have an accumulation of these proteins in the brain, they're less likely to trigger neuroinflammation and trigger cognitive deficits. Exercise is also, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, one of the best ways to build these other types of resilience. So if we think about, broader physiological or psychological resilience, so how well do we tolerate stresses, or how well do we perform under pressure, or when we're sleep deprived or stressed. And so the real kind of thing that ties all these things together, I think, is that if we intermittently stress the system, and basically anytime we activate focus or attention, anytime we do exercise, anytime we do something difficult with our bodies, right, we are creating a stress response. And then as long as we provide time to adapt and recover from it, that's what builds function. That's when function is built, is during the recovery period. And as you do that, you build greater buffer in the system such that when that system is under stress, which we will all experience, right? We'll experience bad nights of sleep. We'll experience, periods when we're sort of really under the cosh or time pressure, or we're sick. But if we've sort of built up that greater buffer through these kind of graded exposures to these different stresses, like exercise, then we're much better able to tolerate those things.
Hey, Greg, quick question, if I can, to Tommy. Tommy, when I read your book, one of the takeaways was the big four, right? The things you just mentioned or alluded to, sleep, nutrition, exercise. And then the fourth is social connection or connectivity. The first three, sleep, nutrition, exercise, I think most of us have a general understanding, and certainly there's research and studies out there. We can go find, what's an adequate amount of sleep for a healthy brain. The one that's a bit missing or cloudy to me is the social interaction. Are there studies or things that you found in your research that would suggest here's how you measure that, and here's what's preventative or adding to the headroom as you described in the book?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting area of research because, like you said, it's kind of difficult to measure. Like, how do I measure how many friends you have? And how do I measure the effect that has on you? And so there are different parts that you can look at. One is like your number of social contacts. So like, how many people do you spend time with on a daily basis? Another one is how do you feel? And so this is what they study in a lot of studies is like, do you feel lonely? Because you can be alone without feeling lonely, right? So, and it's the loneliness that triggers a number of sort of downstream physiological effects. It changes the immune system. It changes stress responses. This is like an evolutionary hardwired survival response. So a lot of it is just driven by our own individual needs, right? Because a lot of people get concerned when you talk about social connection when they're introverts and they're like, well, I don't really like people, right? So if I'm like forcing you to go out and spend more time with more people because I say it's good for you, right? That's actually not good for you. So it's much more, when they look at research about social connection and social interaction, a few things kind of pop out. So a low number of social contacts or people who feel lonely or unsupported. And so that's like, if you have an emergency, do you have people you can call who will come and help you? Like, that's the sort of like one way to express that. Or people who live alone, on average, tend to feel lonelier. So like, do you have a spouse? Do you have a partner? Do you live with somebody? But it doesn't need to be a human. So actually, there are several studies that show that people who live alone but have a pet, so like a cat or a dog, actually they have similar benefits. And some of that comes from probably the pro-social behavior, which has really beneficial physiological effects. Like, you can measure it in terms of stress responses and activation of the vagus nerve, which we know is sort of important for regulating sort of relaxation and inflammation. And so it's having the opportunity to do nice things for other people or other beings. They don't have to be human. That seems to have this sort of particularly magical effect. So those are the ways that they kind of look at it. And we see that people who are alone or feel lonely have an increased risk of dementia. And those who have good social contacts and good social support and don't feel lonely, they have a lower risk of dementia. And so like, all those different parts come into play. So a lot of it is just like, how do you feel about the social environment that you have? Like, that's kind of, and it's a little hard to quantify, but that's where but you kind of see that picture consistently across, dozens of studies.
That's a great answer. Can I add one more thing to that, Tommy? I'm curious about, I've often said to people, there's something about the energy in between people when you're actually in the same room. Is there much research on that? Like, when we talk about, like the four of us are all doing a remote recording right now, and yes, there's a connection here, but is there anything that are we meant to be more in a room with each other if we're not completely introverted people, but I'm just mean in general?
Yeah, so there definitely seems to be a hierarchy. And a lot of this research came out of the lockdowns during COVID-19, where people had differing levels of interaction online versus in person. And the overarching answer is like, in person is almost always better, as long as you're, interacting with people that you enjoy interacting with. However, if you're using some kind of online platform, video is better than voice only, and voice is better than text only, right? So there's kind of like that kind of hierarchy, as you'd kind of expect. But if you're using a platform to create a connection with somebody else that you wouldn't have otherwise, that seems to be a net benefit. And there are actually very interesting studies, particularly in older adults. If you teach them how to use messaging or social media platforms that allows them to connect with others, that results in a net benefit.
Wow.
However, if you're using these platforms instead of meeting those people in person, right? So if all of your social contact happens through Instagram, and that's instead of doing that in person, that's a net negative. Mm-hmm. So it's all about, are you creating opportunities for connection that you wouldn't have otherwise, rather, and avoiding avoiding moving in person to online, because it's easier to sit on the couch and just scroll through social media.
That makes perfect sense. I want to shift gear a little bit and bring it into David's expertise, and where David gets excited here about the data and the metrics that you're using to sort of understand brain performance and aging risk. What are the big things that jump out to you that we need to be looking at? David, this is a great time for you to chime in, obviously, because what we do here at Voloridge Health is we are a data science company. We're looking at every data input you can possibly look at to understand aging and disease risk and everything else going forward, and we're learning as much as we can. So, Tommy, having you on this show with us right now, this is where we can really take a bit of a deep dive into this avenue. But Tommy, I'd love you to go first, and David, I'd love you to kick in afterwards.
I think across all the different areas that we've already talked about, all kind of touched upon, mentioned at least briefly, some measure of all those things is going to be important, because within each individual, these things will probably have differing levels of effect, or change their risk in different ways. So having some understanding of somebody's total stress burden, which we might call allostatic load, which you can actually, there are some signatures you can pick up in blood tests, for instance. So high allostatic load looks a lot like metabolic syndrome. So you end up with high blood sugar, dysregulated lipids, high inflammation, so high CRP. You often see low vitamin D, although it's hard to know whether that's sort of cause or consequence. They might but they tend to move together. Then people who have a high allostatic load are also more likely to smoke, more likely to drink more. So there are kind of signatures of some of this that you can pick up in harder quantitative data, and then some idea of social connection. That's going to be important. But then we sort of mentioned exercise briefly. Some degree of physical fitness is certainly going to be important. Cardiovascular fitness we know is critical. Maintains blood flow to the brain, which and the blood flow, the blood network, the vascular network in the brain essentially allows that whole thing to run. Right, you can have as many neurons as you want, but if they don't get blood flow, right, you're stuffed. So, cardiovascular fitness and cardiovascular health is critical. As are sort of nutrient status related to that. So I mentioned vitamin D, but also omega-3s, homocysteine is a marker of B vitamin requirement. Iron status is critical, and so those are going to be important components. So the fitness side, but we know that you probably don't need to be hitting sort of really extreme levels of VO2 max or something like that. There are some interesting studies that suggest that one reason why VO2 max is a really good predictor of mortality and dementia and stuff is because it tracks with total amount of physical activity and body composition, right? So if your body composition is better and you're more physically active, your VO2 max is better. And actually it's the body composition and just the overall physical activity that's the primary driver, and VO2 max is just a proxy of those things.
That should make you feel better, Barry. He's always upset that his VO2 is not higher, but I think, Tommy, you just made his day.
Yeah, and do you know, there's another study, Barry, where they looked at VO2 max as a predictor of mortality, and they estimated that for every 1 point increase in your VO2 max, you would live 45 days longer. So you would need to increase your VO2 max by 15 to live a year longer, and that's just not worth it for anybody. So you just need enough, and probably it's because it's driven by these other things, just regular movement, good body composition, etc. So
Just to set the record straight, my VO2 max is decent. It's just compared to an Olympian, it's not very high.
No, I mean,
Yeah,
you brought it
trying
up.
to catch up with Greg.
No, that's not fair.
Yeah.
You've brought it up and said, "Oh, my VO2 is not as high as I want." I wasn't hammering you.
You can't compare to Greg. Like that's just not. That's not fair. That's not fair.
It's not fair.
So like fitness is important, as is strength. So we've done some studies looking at population data which suggests that relative strength, so like how strong you are for your weight or your body mass, is an important predictor of things like this was processing speed, a certain type of cognitive function test. So I think that's going to be a critical component too. And you will probably have seen something like this from the data. There have been studies from the UK Biobank which show that the stronger people they are with grip strength, essentially the lower mortality risk, the lower dementia risk. But there's a disconnection between strength and muscle mass. So in men in particular, at high levels of muscle mass, they start to see increased risks of mortality and cardiovascular disease. I'm not sure if they've looked at dementia in that specific way. But what that's showing is that if you're bigger, you need to get stronger to go with it, right? Because if you're bigger but not strong with it, there's that disconnection, right? That's the problem. And I think this is because the main reason that people gain muscle mass is because they've just gained total mass, right? And that's very different from going to the gym and like specifically doing resistance training to build specific strength. So I think those, across all of those things, that's gonna, the nutrient status, all the different levels of fitness and like all those other markers, I think that's going to get you pretty close in terms of being able to ascertain somebody's risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after reading your book, it really got me motivated to look into data at some of the areas you discussed, and certainly was able to see the consistency and the measures. And I took a dive at looking at grip strength, for example, and we saw that, like, sure enough, it was a very high predictor of pretty much every disease. Yeah. You sort of look at the weakest 10% versus the strongest 10%, they have a 3x risk of dementia.
Wow.
And 2x risk of mortality, 2x risk of type 2 diabetes, and sort of the list goes on. And so that causes us to look a little deeper too, because you talk a lot about avoiding dementia in your book, and so I started looking at some of the predictors and the measures of that. And one of the proteins that we looked at was GFAP, and that's a protein that generally increases as you age. It's also relatively independent of your genetics. So we sort of think of if you have this genetic risk, you're sort of rolling the dice and getting dementia. But there's obviously this other component, which sort of gives us clues that there's a lot that we can do about it, even if the genetics are not ideal for avoiding dementia. And then, so after looking more into your book, I said, okay, well, let's see if muscle mass and GFAP protein are correlated. And sure enough, they were highly negatively correlated. So it sort of suggests that working on increasing your muscle mass lowers this protein, which is highly correlated to dementia, and there might be something you can do about it.
That's very cool. So, like, for those who aren't familiar with GFAP, it's glial fibrillary acidic protein. It's mainly produced by astrocytes in the brain, and it's long been used, at least in sort of research studies, as a marker of brain injury, because as the astrocytes get stressed or injured, and they make up a significant number of the cells in the brain, they're sort of like intimately connected to the blood network and the neurons around them. As they get injured, GFAP gets sort of released into the bloodstream. Well, that's kind of what people think happens. And so did GFAP, was it better predicted by muscle mass, or was it better predicted by grip strength? Was there a difference in terms of those relationships?
We didn't actually run grip strength against GFAP specifically, but we did look at the fat-free mass in detail.
Cool.
but GFAP again had that correlation.
Great, more bicep curls.
We look a lot at the genetics too, and certainly we all know genetics is a huge predictor of dementia. And I would say the most commonly known part of that is how many copies of the APOE4 gene do you have, right? And of course, if you're fortunate to have no copies, then you sort of have a baseline relatively low risk. With one copy, it's 2.5 times risk, and with 2 copies of the gene, you have a 7.5 times risk. And that 7.5 times ends up, like if you have 2 copies, almost 50% of people will go on to get dementia. And so, but it's not like you're just rolling the dice. You've got this other component unrelated to genetics. And so it's sort of, again, we don't know what percentage, but a good amount is in your, I think it is in our power to be in that 50% that does not get it, even if you have the 2 copies of the gene.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Sure enough, someone who's unhealthy with no copies of the gene actually can have higher risk, we see, than a healthy person with 1 or 2 copies of the APOE4 mutation. So you can still screw it up even if you think, okay, I got lucky genetics, I'm not going to get it. You still got to do something.
Yeah, the way this, and I think it's important to note that, right, there's actually several studies that suggest the environment is like the environment interacts with APOE4, right? Because there are several populations where APOE4 doesn't increase the risk of dementia, which is probably a lot driven by the environment. But most people who have dementia don't have APOE4, right? And not everybody who has APOE4 gets dementia. So like that kind of suggests that there's going to be these really important other factors that, the majority of which, hopefully we have under our control.
Was that Chris Hemsworth when he was on that show? Is it Limitless?
Yeah.
He had both, right?
Yes,
and
I think
did
he
a whole
has.
episode
He's
on that.
homozygous for E4.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. No, I remember seeing that. Are there any other sort of genes that we look at? I mean, we have APOE that I feel like it's constantly discussed around dementia. Is there anything else that David, Tommy, you guys are seeing in the data?
I think when you sort of roll up a whole model and provide scores for people, and again, we basically do that. You take all the variables. I mean, even high blood sugar is correlated to dementia. There's a number of measurable biomarkers, both in our blood work and physical measures, that predict. And when you put that all into a model, you can actually measure it. And so, again, you can see a score based on your blood work and influenceable factors. So you can kind of see, you can be looking at a scale and say, okay, I'm going to try some program. Did it work for me? And you can see if that score went up or down, and that's highly corresponds to your probability of future dementia.
So Tommy, do you have on your end, as David's building out these models with his team, that we're able to, in the future, have some scores that really have a holistic view? Are there biomarkers that stand out to you for people when they're looking at cognitive decline, call it dementia, that people should be looking at as they go along here? Hemoglobin A1C, you guys have both mentioned blood sugar and all these things. Are there biomarkers that stand out to you both? We've done episodes here where we're like, these are, 5 biomarkers we think people should get, cystatin C, ApoB, all these things. But is there things that jump out to you, Tommy?
Yes. So looking at, like large, like meta-analyses or, studies, including multiple studies in multiple populations, there are a few things that kind of jump out, and especially as like they're easy to measure and they're modifiable, right? And I think that's where we can give people some agency and power. So like we've mentioned blood sugar several times. We know that the higher your blood sugar, right? If you have pre-diabetes, you have a faster rate of cognitive decline. If you have type 2 diabetes, you have an even faster rate of cognitive decline on average. So treating high blood sugar, treating metabolic disease, we know is critical. The marker that actually has probably the best evidence in terms of if we can improve it, we significantly decrease dementia risk, and that can be, if you improve it pharmacologically or some other way, is high blood pressure. So there are now several randomized controlled trials that show that if you treat high blood pressure, you decrease that person's dementia risk. So high blood pressure and high blood sugar are probably some of the two most important ones. And that's within sort of like the constellation of sort of metabolic syndrome type criteria. So the other ones being high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and a high waist circumference. Although those I think are important too. And then I would layer on some of the nutrient biomarkers that we know are critical from many different studies. So again, either having low iron, so a low hemoglobin, usually more common in women, seems to track with like cognitive changes that occur around perimenopause. It's often because they have anemia or low levels of iron. At the other end, high hemoglobin, more common in men, often is associated with obstructive sleep apnea, which we know is a significant risk factor for dementia. And again, if you treat that, your dementia risk comes down. Obstructive sleep apnea being if you stop breathing properly during sleep, you become hypoxic. And as a result, what happens when you become hypoxic is you make more hemoglobin. And athletes leverage this all the time by training at altitude, hypoxia chambers, all that kind of stuff. But if it's happening because you're not breathing when you're asleep, that's almost always a bad thing. Iron, vitamin D status, we know is critical. Omega-3 status and homocysteine levels are both critical. Unfortunately, they weren't measured in the UK Biobank. So like the UK Biobank being probably like the best large population data set we have access to, and they just didn't measure those things. But we know that those...
Actually, we do. They do have omega-3.
They have omega-3, they don't have homocysteine. Yeah.
So we could actually run those numbers during the show, actually.
Cool. Yeah, so I don't think they have homocysteine though. If I remember correctly.
Quick thing I wanted to see.
Do not have homocysteine.
Yeah.
While David's doing that, if your research, corroborates, is the lipids. You mentioned lipids a minute or two ago, and HDL. I think in particular, our data analysis indicates that high LDL is actually preventative for dementia. Do you feel like there's enough literature that has evidence of that, or do you feel like that's maybe a controversial or an unfounded view at this point?
Yeah, it's you see this signature again and again and again that as people get older, higher levels of LDL cholesterol are associated with longevity. The problem is, I don't think anybody's ever yet been able to figure out or disentangle like reverse causality. So like you die of something else earlier, or you have some disease that's lowering your LDL, and that's what kills you first. You need to live a long time and not die of something else to get dementia, right? So you have competing risks. And so if you have high LDL, but you manage to avoid a heart attack, right, that then may give a signal of dementia prevention. So I think that LDL or ApoB in particular is still a potentially important modifiable risk factor for dementia. But in these large population studies, it's really hard to disentangle like all the different reasons why you might have a higher or lower level. And I think they also interact with other aspects of health. So we know that if you have poor metabolic health, high insulin, high blood sugar, then that increases the risk associated with having higher ApoB or higher LDL cholesterol. So it's not just a case of higher is better or worse. There are these complex interactions, across all the different competing risks. But what you're seeing, it has been shown in many population studies previously. It's just like figuring out how all those different pieces of the system interact.
Yeah, the LDL relationship's pretty complex because we see in our data low LDL is a very high risk factor for dementia, and it's low, not high. But the genetics for LDL is a positive risk factor for so it's sort of flip the other way. So then that makes you sort of look at the delta. It's really the change between LDL and where your genetics says you should be. Yeah, that lower really spikes at risk. So that's there's something driving that delta that's probably driving that true risk. Yes. So I would say it might be the reverse causation, but still an important indicator.
Yeah.
That's something that is causing a drop in LDL is causing dementia.
Yeah.
I did run some of the other numbers. Omega 3s is actually a risk factor, more for men than for women. So people with the lowest 10% have about 80% increased risk of dementia than the highest 10% on omega 3 level.
What you see from the interventional studies, the randomized controlled trials, is that omega 3s and homocysteine or B vitamin status interact. So if you have good omega 3 status but poor B vitamin status, you don't benefit from having that good omega 3 status, and vice versa. And so they've shown that, like, if you supplement with B vitamins to bring down your homocysteine, you don't benefit unless you have good omega 3 status. And again, vice versa. If you supplement with omega 3s, you don't benefit if your homocysteine is raised. So there's like another sort of like interesting interaction there.
It is, yes. Interesting, for women, it's not as strong a relationship. It's only a 30% reduction in risk versus 80%. And then, but on mortality, it was very most all-cause mortality was strong for men and women, where the lowest for women had 70% higher mortality than the highest, and for men 90% higher mortality than the lowest. So pretty big, at least important for overall health.
Yeah, I wonder if part of the difference in signal is driven by the fact that the women are better at, because I don't know which omega 3s they measured, but like in real time, women are better at converting shorter chain omega 3s to longer chain omega 3s than men are, because it's so critical for them to do that to provide enough long chain omega 3s for the baby during pregnancy. And they get even better at it. Actually, some of those processes are upregulated even more during pregnancy. So I wonder if they're kind of protected somehow because they've got more capacity in that system. Be hard to test, but that would be an interesting question.
Yeah, it does give some clues about the biological mechanism when you sort of see a different pattern with men and women and something like that. Just answering the previous question, because I had looked up grip strength as well.
Oh yeah.
Interestingly, grip strength is not correlated to GFAP.
Oh, interesting.
Which means that on the show we discovered that there's another independent risk factor.
Yeah. So that's a benefit of gains even if you don't get stronger. Great.
Yeah. So,
there we go. This is not just a podcast. This is a research show, everybody. We're finding things out right now.
Research
on the fly.
workshop. To that end, Tommy, maybe higher level, we love numerical analysis. And in the book you mentioned 1 out of 10 adults over 65 get dementia. Curious if that trend has changed very much in recent decades. And if so, what do you think is driving that change?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's really interesting because the answer is yes, but it's not what you expect. So the age, and it's a very specific way of measuring it, but the age-specific incidence of dementia has been decreasing in the majority of US and European populations. And what I mean by that is at the age of 60 or 70, you're now less likely to have dementia than you would have had 20 or 30 years ago. The total lifetime risk of dementia is increasing because we're living longer. It's just that we're getting diagnosed with dementia later because we're not dying of other things first. There are a few potential reasons for this. The one that most people think has been the most impactful is the population health focus on cardiovascular disease, so treating and preventing heart disease. For that reason, in some of the studies, that benefit in terms of a decrease in age-specific instances of dementia may be larger in men than in women because cardiovascular disease is generally more common in men than in women. But there are a number of other things that kind of play a role too. So looking at the Framium study in the US, brain size has been increasing across decades, starting in birth cohorts, like people born in like the 30s to the 40s to the 50s. In general, brain size acts as brain reserve, which we know is a protective against dementia. And that increased in the first half and then again, then a little bit more into the second half of the 20th century. And probably a lot of that may have been due to like less smoking, less heart disease, as we treated that better. But I think a lot of it was just due to better food that we got access to after the Second World War and the Great Depression. We saw actually nutrient status and health status of the population improved. So that probably helped with some of that, because some of those individuals were getting dementia then at the end of the 20th century or beginning of the 21st century. And then during that same time period, we've had a greater increase in access to both education and the job market for women, which we know is an important protective factor against dementia. And so the women in the workforce in the US didn't really expand until the 1970s. Before then, the studies, when you kind of look at dementia and dementia risk factors, they're looking at women as homemakers and mainly spending most of their time at home. But we know that education and complex jobs are protective against dementia. So I think all of those things were kind of changing in the 20th century that may have been driving some of that decrease in age-specific incidence of dementia. However, people now think there's a turn in the other direction because the metabolic health of the population has continued to decline. So everything else has gotten better except for like obesity, type 2 diabetes, that kind of stuff, which is kind of gone and continued to grow. Except now with the onset of GLP-1s, we might turn that tide at the population level, which I think will have a big impact if we can prevent or treat type 2 diabetes sustainably, right? That's going to have a massive impact at population level dementia risk. So some of that may even really translate into big changes as well.
What a great answer, mate. That was fantastic. Full breakdown of the last 150 years. Barry, you happy with that?
Yeah, that was great. Awesome. That was excellent. And just watching time, I know we only have 5 or so minutes. I was going to ask Greg, do we have maybe time to do rapid fire with Tommy, but wanted to see if you guys like that idea to do a few rapid fire questions. Dave, did you have anything else on the analytical side that you wanted to cover before we dive into that?
The only thing, just sort of filling in the dementia risk for high blood sugar, as you alluded to, diabetes is about 2x for people with an A1C over 6.0, and that's the top 10%. And of course, diabetes is even higher than that, so it's very significant.
I like that, Barry. I do want to also just, Tommy, quick 1 minute, actionable steps that people should be doing. I know we've kind of touched on it throughout this episode, but you talk about it, the 5 key domains in your book. What do people need to be really focused on? The 4 majors plus connections. Big takeaway. Somebody listening to this is going, right, I'm not going to get dementia because I'm listening to Tommy Wood right now.
So I will give you a very quick overview of, so I think there are 3 main buckets of things that are important that sort of drive brain health across the lifespan. This is what I call the 3S model. This is kind of what the book builds to, and it's kind of described in one of the last chapters of the book. Those 3 S's are stimulus, supply, and support. Stimulus is how we use our brains, right? So it's, are you learning new skills? Are you doing complex tasks? Are you playing some kind of complex sport? Are you dancing, learning languages, right? You don't need to do all of them. It's just having something that you're not good at that you're getting better at, right? That drives the improved function of those networks I mentioned at the beginning of the show. Then the supply bucket is, have you got good cardiovascular health? Have you got good metabolic health, right? These are, can you get blood flow and energy to the brain? Have you got good nutrient status? Those nutrients we talked about, right? These are critical to kind of run the whole brain. And then the support bucket is, you're stimulating the brain, you're giving it everything it needs. Are you letting it rest and recover so it builds capacity, right? Sleep is critical there. Then we want to avoid things that inhibit that adaptation process, like drinking too much alcohol, smoking, avoiding chronic stress, right? We talked about resilience and being able to deal with stress. Chronic stress creates almost this like overtraining effect in the brain that it can never really like recover and adapt. And so I give those 3 buckets because like for each individual person, they might be like, oh yeah, that bucket sounds like the bucket that I need to think about, right? And so then within that bucket, pick one thing that feels like a doable thing that you can address. And the reason why I say that is because all those buckets interact. So if you sleep a bit better, then we know your blood sugar improves and your blood pressure improves and you feel more social the next day and you're more likely to engage in cognitively challenging tasks. Right? We avoid cognitively challenging tasks when we're sleep deprived. So, and we see that with exercise, right? So, and changing your diet and all these things. So change one thing and the whole kind of network starts to shift in your favor. So then just like pick one thing that feels kind of like resonates with you and the dominoes start to fall from there.
I really like that. Stimulate, supply, and support. Fantastic. I like that a lot. All right. Do you want to go around the horn, Barry, with the rapid fire? We'll throw one at him each.
Let's do it. And Tommy, the rule is you can answer, you can say TBD, pass, right? If there's the jury's out, that's fine. So I'll start if that's okay, Greg. My question is, which form of exercise is most beneficial for dementia avoidance and cognitive health?
Open skill exercise. So broadly, an exercise that includes some kind of cardiovascular challenge plus elements of complex motor coordination plus rapid response times and or strategy. So board sports, ball sports, martial arts, as long as you're not getting kicked in the head. Those kinds of, if I had to pick one, those would be dancing, like those would be best.
Cool.
David, we got to get our tennis game on, buddy.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking the same.
David, you want to go or are you still thinking of one?
Well, I guess I'll follow that up with what diet is the best diet for avoiding dementia?
A diet that allows you to maintain energy balance, right? So you don't regularly overeat it, so you end up with excess energy availability and metabolic disease. That includes all the nutrients that we mentioned earlier, omega-3s, B vitamins, etc. And that you will consistently eat for decades. How that looks can be very different from person to person. So like hit the nutrients, don't like enter into like excess energy availability and overeating. And if you do that sustainably for decades, like that's it.
I like it. All right, Tommy, stimulants. Obviously, caffeine's at the top. That's where I'm going with. Yes or no?
Stimulants. So this is a longer answer. Stimulants are very interesting because across most stimulants, so I'm talking caffeine, but also things like the stimulants that we use for ADHD, methylphenidate, Adderall, etc. They create a slight disconnection between how we feel and how we perform. So they make us feel great, but we don't necessarily perform better. And it's because they can often overstimulate us and we end up like too far into our sort of, there's this idea of an arousal curve, right? So there's a bell-shaped curve for arousal and performance. And like there's some optimal level of arousal for complex performance, complex skill performance. And stimulants can often push us too high up there. So like they make us jittery or anxious. And so there are lots of studies that show that for complex cognitive tasks, giving people stimulants makes them think they're performing better, but they're not actually performing better. And sometimes they're performing worse. The one caveat is that caffeine seems to be particularly good in the setting of sleep deprivation. Because that, in that setting, we're sort of under aroused. And we down-regulate certain dopamine receptors in the brain when we're sleep deprived that then makes it harder to kind of focus and pay attention. But caffeine upregulates those receptors again. So that's where caffeine kind of comes into its own. But you need to remember that if you like drink a bunch of caffeine to overcome your sleep deprivation, then it will make it harder to sleep the next night and you'll kind of stay in a cycle of sleep deprivation. So says the guy who had a nice big cup of coffee this morning, right? I'm not against stimulants, of course.
We can tell, mate. You've been just going. I'm just kidding. You're crushing it.
So like, absolutely use these things, but just appreciate that sometimes they're not always making you perform. They're not always making you perform better. They might just be making you think that you're performing better.
Which is sometimes worth it. The placebo's worth it.
Oh yeah, placebo's a great thing. If you can leverage placebo effect, fantastic.
Perfect. Barry, David, anything else you want to add? We're coming up on the hour. I know Tommy has to run here. Anything?
I had one more rapid fire if we have time. Tommy, it's up to you though.
Yeah, let's go.
should we ever retire? You talk about retirement in the book and the cognitive benefits of work. Should we ever retire or work forever?
So I think we can retire as in, so like in the book, I basically give this whole story about why I think retirement is the worst idea that the brain ever encountered, because it drives a significant drop in cognitive function as we remove the stimulus, cognitive and social stimuli we receive from work. But we can retire, right? You can finish your job and not work for money, but we shouldn't like fully retire as in retire from using our brain to engage with the world and do interesting and complex things, right? So you can replace work with skill learning, travel, volunteering, a whole bunch of things that still require you to kind of use your brain and then go out into the world and express the skills and knowledge that you've developed across your career or lifetime. That's great. So yes, it's you can have like true retirement, but not like actual retirement, if that makes sense.
You're not retiring your brain.
Exactly.
I think we just solved the Social Security problem. We'll raise the retirement age by 5 years based on Tommy's advice. It's funded.
And we'll decrease the burden on the healthcare system because people are going to get less dementia.
There we go. All right, Tommy, David, and Barry, do you want to say your farewells?
Thank you so much, Tommy. That was
Thank you,
awesome.
Tommy. Thanks for coming on.
Really appreciate you, Tommy. And The Stimulated Mind, it comes out March 24th of 2026, if people are listening to this later. Where do they find it? Can they pre-order?
So pre-orders and more information, you can either go to my website, drtommywood.com, drtommywood.com, or thestimulatedmind.com. There are some pre-order goodies that will be there. You can get like a chapter of the book in advance and a few other things that I put together, a workout video that I did. And then, anywhere you buy books, it's available for pre-order, and then will be available on the day of release.
Well, congratulations again.
One thing we should mention, Greg, that I wanted to, we got Tommy first in his podcast circuit, but he's going on some huge shows like the Joe Rogan experience and stuff like that. So people will be seeing a lot more of Tommy, promoting his book, and we're delighted that we had a chance to chat with him early in his process.
Yep.
That's delighted to have been here and chat with you guys. I always love hanging out with you. It's so much fun.
Mate, really cool. An amazing book. Really appreciate you, Tommy. I know you've got probably another podcast you're doing later today, so we better let you go. So many great, impactful things in this episode. So again, thanks, mate.
Thank you.
Thanks, buddy.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, Tommy.